Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. 2024 marks 80 years since the founding of the Liberal Party of Australia. The party is an enduring legacy of Robert Menzies and others. Today's episode of Afternoon Light forms part of a special 10-part series to commemorate this 80th anniversary. Each of the 10 episodes will feature an author from our upcoming book on the founding of the Liberal Party, Unity in Autonomy. The book will be available from Connor Court and the Robert Menzies Institute's website in October this year. The South Australian Liberal Party is one of the oldest political parties in the country. An example of centre-right unity, the Liberal Country League held on to government for a record 32 years from 1933 until 1950. It's no surprise then that South Australia had an important role in the founding of the Liberal Party of Australia in 1944. Joining me to discuss this is former Senator for South Australia, Baden Teague. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Baden.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be talking about South Australia and Menzies.
So two great topics, and of course as a person who grew up in South Australia, I have a deep interest and fondness and attachment for all things South Australia. And it's great to have a bit of South Australian history on the Afternoon Light podcast. We have had Clem McIntyre in the past, but we need more of it, Baden. So it's really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Georgina. And as it happens, I was born in 1944, which was the Unity Conference convened by Menzies.
That's very auspicious.
Very auspicious.
And that means you've got a big birthday.
Next month, I'm 80, and in October, the Liberal Party of Australia is 80.
Yes, yeah. Oh, well, that's lovely to have both celebrations in the same year and big, important milestone, no doubt, for you and your family. I didn't realise quite how old, though, Baden, the South Australian Liberal Party was. So can you tell me about when it was first formed and the circumstances in which it was formed? Because I think that this is really important as part of this series we're doing on the founding of the Liberal Party, this idea that each state had a different story in the coming together, and those stories make each Liberal Party in the states a little bit different.
The Liberal Party in South Australia is a remarkable story. We began in 1910, and the leading personality was Archibald Peake. Now, Peake was Premier of South Australia. He was an independent Liberal, and he represented a southeast country seat. He was highly regarded by all sides of Parliament through the period 1900, 1910, and he died in 1920. Now, in 1910, there'd been an election of a Labor majority government, perhaps the first Labor majority government ever elected in the whole world. And they were led by a man called Varan, member for Wallaroo, and they did nothing about Labor strikes. There was discord, chaos in the community, not only in Adelaide, but in the countryside. And therefore, the other two groups in the Parliament of South Australia said, look, we've got to solve this and we've got to stop this Labor mayhem. And therefore, the Liberals and the Conservatives came together and fused. This fusion of Liberal and Conservative was the formation of the Liberal Union. The name was chosen because it was seen to be more popular and actually more genuinely describing the progressive nature of the Liberal Union. And Peake was its first leader. He became Premier at the very next election and remained the outstanding political figure in South Australia. So 1910 is when the Liberal Union began in South Australia.
And as you said, it was a joining together of this Farmers and Producers Union, the Liberal Democratic Union, the Australian National League as well, wasn't it? So you had quite disparate voices of country representatives, Conservatives, and then Liberal progressives all coming together. How did they engage with philosophical ideas and differences? Or was that not necessarily the focus for the political grouping that became the Liberal Union?
Well, in my book, The Liberal Story, published last year, I've set out a full answer to that question. They did address philosophical and especially policy matters, and they maturely came to a hard-wrought, well-discussed, clear, united approach to policy, and they established principles of the Liberal Union, and that was all published and agreed to, and it remained in place. Now, the problem, which was hardest to overcome, was that the Liberals had been dissatisfied with the status quo approach of the Conservatives, and yet they were now seeking to marry the Conservatives. And so quite a number of the Liberals found that very difficult. They'd criticised each other across the chamber, and Peake, seeing the strategy that it was essential for the three political parties, I call them two, because the Farmers Group was really the Australian National League in the country, and the ANL was the Conservatives in the city. The Conservatives and the Liberals just had to get together, and Peake understood that really clearly, and he won the Liberal Union's support from his own group, Liberal Democratic Party, only by one vote.
Wow.
His own vote. And so there were one or two who didn't come over to the Union and remained independent Liberals. The majority group did come over, and the Conservative group provided resources and a fund and a branch structure, which was the best developed, and that was superb in making sure the Liberal Union took off from the beginning. So they did address the policy issues of the day. For example, take reform of Legislative Council was a top agenda item for all parties. The Labor Party were going to abolish Legislative Council, even in those early days. The Liberal Democratic Party wanted a democracy. They wanted to widen the franchise. The Conservatives didn't want to move at all. So they actually agreed on a in-between compromise. And then they all stuck to that. And that compromise was actually legislated by the Peake government after 1912. So they were honest about things. They conscientiously agreed on philosophy and policy and on structure.
Why do you think they were successful when so many other political parties of the centre-right, the non-Labor side, were being formed and then collapsing? There was a lot of fluidity through that pre-World War I period. Was it their organisational structures that they had? Was it just the identities who were involved, like Archibald Peake, who was able to cut through the disagreements and get people to see the value of being combined force rather than two or three separate forces?
Yep. There were three factors, I think. The first one was that it was a well-thought-out fusion of Liberals and Conservatives. They didn't do it in a superficial way. They really thought about it carefully and achieved a fusion. Deakin did the same in 1909 federally, and that one had its ups and downs, but it eventually became the National Party that we know in the 20s and so on. The second factor was that the Liberal Union, at the very next election, won office and kept office, except for a very brief period in the 1915-18 period because of the First World War and because of drought. These were two huge factors causing economic dismay in the South Australian community, and the incumbent government, whoever it was to suffer. And so they suffered. But nevertheless, Peake held his policies firm, his leadership firm, and they then returned to government to rescue South Australia from the division of the Labor Party over the conscription issue, where the Labor Party, of course, split all around Australia. And then they stayed in office until 1924. Peake had died in 20. His successor, Barwell, was not as convincing and, in fact, was on the nose when he was defeated in 24. So the fact that the Liberal Union won office for about 12 years, straight after it was formed, very much consolidated the party and its processes. But the biggest factor was Peake himself. He was a gentleman. He was very experienced. He was able to speak more fluently in political debate than almost anybody in the whole of Australia. Punch magazine, for instance, had a political review of Peake in 1919, and they said as much. So I regard these as the factors that led to the enduring of the Liberal Union.
What was his particular political philosophy, Archibald Peake? Did he come with a very distinct set of ideas that I guess still have their legacy in the modern day South Australian Liberal Party?
Yes, he was very much a family man. They had 6 children. He was very much wanting a rural community to work, in his case, Narracourt. He had been involved in the Presbyterian Church, well, totally involved, and his wife. So he had Christian values, he had family values, he had a rural community set of values. But in addition, he was liberal. He wanted the ordinary man to prosper. He wanted, in particular, education to be available to all. He was the librarian of the Narracourt Library for a long time before he came to Parliament, and he went about that with great vigour. He was, in the short period that he was in opposition as leader during the First World War, he wrote a column for the Advertiser on prose and poetry in the English language. And so he was very committed to education and to family and Christian values.
Oh, well, he sounds like quite an incredible figure of South Australian history, and I doubt there were many librarians who became Premier of South Australia, so that's incredibly unique as well. South Australia doesn't have a national party presence, which, of course, the precursor to which was the Country Party. Obviously, when the South Australian Liberal Party or Liberal Union was formed, it was bringing together agricultural, rural members into the fold. But there was a Country Party in existence as well. How did that merge with the Liberal Party? Because that, of course, then has an ongoing legacy for, well, to this day, doesn't it?
That's right. Now, there was a small group of South Australians during the 1920s who wanted, nevertheless, despite the success of the Liberal Union, and as partly a reaction to Barwell, who was not popular, they wanted the formation of a Country Party. So there were 1 or 2, at the most 4, during the 1920s, members of Parliament who were calling themselves the Country Party. Now, it was a very strong objective of Butler, who succeeded Barwell, and Butler became a great success in the late 1920s. He was Premier for 3 years, and then he won that important election in 1933 and served for 5 years as Premier again. Now, Butler had the old Peake strategy to get the Country Party, please, to join with us and for us to be one party. And he was successful in winning over 3, but not the 4th. In 1927, 3 of them came over. He made McIntosh one of his ministers, and he remained a minister under Playford too for about 40 years. So McIntosh Country Party became Liberal Federation. I should explain Liberal Federation was an achievement of Barwell at the very end. It was the name that was given to the amalgamation of the leftover right-wingers of the Labor Party from the conscription split. And they had called themselves National Party or the National Labor Party. And he got them to join the Liberal Union in 1924, and that amalgamation was complete, and the new name was Liberal Federation, but it was the same Liberal Union constitution and structure. So Butler was building on that, and he got 3 of the 4 to come on board with him. Actually, there was another one in the upper house, Bleasing. So the 2 that didn't come were Cameron and Bleasing. I'll get back to that. So there's a preliminary commitment of the Liberal Union, Liberal Federation, to get the Country Party to rejoin with them. But the important thing was the federal politics of 1931. Scullin was in trouble as the Labor Prime Minister. Lyons, former Premier Labor of Tasmania, left his cabinet, resigned in protest, and 5 others joined with him in a vote of no confidence in the Scullin government that was moved by the then National Party, that is, by the Liberals. So in 1931, there was we'll call it Scullin crisis, and the leading politician of South Australia at that time was Charles Hawker. Hawker, a remarkable man, a veteran, seriously injured from First World War, but absolutely diligent to work on it regardless of his injuries. He became president of the Liberal Federation and then the member for Wakefield. He was seen in the late 20s and 30s as a potential Prime Minister of Australia. Unfortunately, he died in 1938 in an air crash. Now, Charles Hawker, in 1931, looking at the Scullin crisis, said, what we've got to do is have a united approach to the federal election. And he took a back seat as Liberal Federation and promoted an independent leader, Archie Grenfell Price, who was a lecturer in geography at the University of Adelaide. He had published a solution to the Depression, that is, stay with orthodox economics, manage debt, weather the crisis and get through. This was also called the Premier's Plan of 1931. Now, the Labor Party were all over the shop with protests about not repaying debts, about having newfangled approaches to the economy. Righto. So Archie Grenfell Price gathered together.
And Baden, it's important to note here, as you say, he was a lecturer in geography. He wasn't a politician. And he was master of St Mark's College at the University of Adelaide, wasn't he? So he's a non-party figure who's given this quite prominent leadership role in political debates, which is quite unusual, I would have thought.
It is very unusual. In fact, it's the only time it's happened in the more than a century of the Liberal Party in South Australia. And the Liberal Party just took a back seat. And they were very much every day advising Archie Grenfell Price. And Charles Hawker and Archie Grenfell Price were great mates. They really understood each other. But you're absolutely correct. He was chosen because he was apolitical. He was not a part of a political party. And he was famous already because in March of 1931, he'd published a serious small book about solving the economics that had led to the Depression. And this had sold 10,000 copies. And he was household name. So when the various half a dozen centre-right political groupings came together, he proposed that they be called the Emergency Committee, and they made him the convener and chairman, and they asked him to be campaign organiser. And putting it all together, he chose the candidates for all federal seats.
Wow.
Simple as that.
So he was a kingmaker. He was
no electoral college at all.
No democracy there.
He negotiated who was the right one. There were about 5 tried and true members of the Liberal Federation who were part of the Nationalist Party in Canberra. But he also chose 2 former Labor members who'd protested along with Lyons. And he also chose 2 or 3 brand new ones, one of whom was the president of the Country Party at the time, a man called Baden for the Senate. Now, cut a long story short, he conducted with them a wonderful campaign, and 9 of the 10 were successful, and they all were standing to support the United Australia Party that Lyons was leading already in Canberra. So this was a wow event. This was a triumph, and it blinded everybody to anything but that approach. So therefore, the very next year, the momentum from the Emergency Committee's success led to negotiations between that little rump of the Country Party that was left. Essentially, it was Archie Cameron this time and Bleasing in the upper house, and they were satisfied straight away. Archie Cameron was promised Barker at the next election. Bleasing was promised Minister for Agriculture in the Butler government, and both achieved that. They would disband the Country Party altogether. Baden was already the president, was already a senator in the UAP, and so it went on. So the collapse of the Country Party, the formation of the Liberal and Country League, LCL, in 1932 was also a triumph. And one of the candidates wooed for that election in 33 was Tom Playford. He won, of course, and he went on to be Premier in 38. So the LCL became very much a success from 1932 onwards, right through till 74, really, when we changed our name and updated and made a modern Liberal Party.
That incredible term in office of 32 years, so from 1933 until 1950, and of course Tom Playford is such a pivotal figure in this as a very long-standing Premier of South Australia for the Liberal Country League. Was that, do you think, really what consolidated that political party?
Yes, I'm sure it was. Playford was all about achievement and he was seen by everyone as successful. But he had a particular regard, a priority for country members of Parliament. He was one himself. He was an orchardist from Norton Summer, and also for the people in their electorates. So he was very much a country-focused South Australian Liberal politician. Every one of his ministers were country people. And there were only 6 ministers. Half of them were fair dinkum farmers. So he also, in the Butler election of 33, although Butler won, there were a huge number, I think about 15, independent Liberal country MPs. Now, they were a narc to Butler, and he eventually was frustrated and gave up, and hence Playford took over. But Playford immediately won their confidence. The number of independents diminished enormously in 38, and then during the Playford period, they all wanted to be a part of the LCL. Even Tom Stott, the one famous standout who remained independent, he was the member for Ridley, which is the Riverland, now Chaffey. Now, Ridley and Stott are famous for events in the 60s and 70s. That's outside the scope of our discussion here. But Stott in Ridley thought the highest of Playford, and he always commended him in every public speech. So Playford was, in every respect, the reason for the continuing success, the endurance of the LCL.
And at a federal level, what was taking place for South Australian representation? They were sitting in the United Australia Party room as Liberal Country League representatives?
No, there was a part of the negotiations for the LCO in 32 gave 2 concessions, apart from those individuals I mentioned who would get promotions. And the 2 concessions were later on got to be called the Playmander, but Playford had nothing to do with it. It was all Butler's negotiations. Playford wasn't at the LCL negotiation in 32. And that was that they would keep a 2-to-1 ratio rural to city seats. So that was one concession. And the second LCL concession was that the federal members of the LCL could choose themselves to sit with the United Australia Parliamentary Party, or they could actually sit with the Country Party. And at the beginning, from 33 onwards, there were 2. That's Badman, the former chairman of the Country Party. He sat with the Country Party. And Archie Cameron, something of a firebrand, who had become the member for Barker, he chose to sit with the Country Party and, in fact, became leader of the Country Party and became Deputy Prime Minister to Menzies in 1937. And he lasted only a year because of rivals McEwen, Fadden and others. And so when he was, he regarded unfairly and rudely deposed as Country Party leader, he then joined forces with Menzies totally and only sat with the United Australia Party and then was a vigorous, enthusiastic supporter of Menzies in the formation of Liberal Party of Australia in 44. Badman actually lost the election in 43 and he was never in the parliament again. So from 44 on, that became a matter of history, this choice. And nobody from 1944 from South Australia in the LCL, or the Liberal Party of Australia, as it was also called, ever sat in the Country Party again after 44.
Yeah, which is, and still to this day, it's very interesting that there is still no National Party representation from South Australia. So it's a long-standing legacy. Baden, I wanted you to tell us about why and how the South Australian federal politicians from the LCL supported Menzies in the lead up to that formation of the Liberal Party in 1944. This is, I guess, particularly around his National Service Group and those issues.
Well, Georgina, it's quite an exciting story. The South Australians were locked into Menzies. They really supported Menzies. The only one who was not of the South Australian federal members in the National Service Group, all 10 were, but one wasn't, and that was Badman, the only one who was with the Country Party too, by the way. So that means there were 16 in the Menzies-led National Service Group that formed in 1943, and 10 of the 16 were South Australians. Right. And that included Archie Cameron, of course, the veteran from First World War. Now, the National Service Group was a protest by members of the United Australia Party against Curtin's do-nothing approach to involve Australians who were conscripted for military service during Second World War to serve outside a very limited domestic zone in the defence of Australia. Menzies argued, and the National Service Group argued, that the Australian soldiers, every member of our military force, should be serving wherever it mattered to win the war. And the leader, only temporary leader, and very old and way out of his prime, Hughes, he was a former Labor man, and he had a commitment to not break with the Defence Act's prescriptions about where conscripted people could serve. So he didn't do anything. And so therefore this National Service Group was also a glove thrown at the feet of Hughes. At the time, Menzies had been deposed as the leader of the opposition, and Hughes was the stopgap. So it was on for all in 1943. They thought that the UAP was heading for disaster in the election of 43, and that is actually what happened. Absolutely. It was about the worst outcome for a Liberal-like federal party ever. So the South Australians were with Menzies in the National Service Group, and that meant in throwing the gauntlet down to Hughes. Secondly, in August 44, Australia had a referendum that Curtin had worked out, and it was called the 14 New Government Powers. This is a socialist takeover from the states and from the people of Australia of certain powers that should have remained with the states or with the people. And it was a referendum in August 44, which Menzies fully opposed. By then he had been returned as leader of the opposition. And this was the thunderous no-vote outcome that Menzies won. And it was, in fact, the launching point for his letter inviting everyone to the Unity Conference of October a few months later. So in the referendum, the South Australians were totally committed to no. There was a huge no vote in South Australia, and so they are totally with Menzies on that point. Now, I should mention that there were three members of federal parliament, McBride, Macleay and Archie Cameron, who were already firm friends of Menzies. McBride was his leader of the Liberal Party of Australia eventually in the Senate. He had been leader of the UAP in the Senate. And when there was the formation of the federal executive of the Liberal Party of Australia, there were two members of parliament. One was Menzies and the other was George Macleay. So George Macleay was the other ex officio member of the federal executive of the LPA from 44 onwards. Now, his personal best friend in South Australia, Menzies, was Philip McBride, and he had been a senator. Then he was to become the member for Wakefield. He went on to be Menzies' Minister for Defence and eventually was the first South Australian to be the president of the Liberal Party of Australia in the late 50s.
It's quite extraordinary, Baden, isn't it, how instrumental these South Australian Liberal Country League politicians were to Menzies' effort to reinvent a political party out of the ashes of the UAP, that they were there with him in huge numbers in the National Service Group, which was really acting as a ginger group.
That's
within
right.
the UAP and challenging Billy Hughes's leadership and his positioning. I mean, they were by far the majority that made up this National Service Group, 10 out of 17 MPs. It's quite incredible. So Menzies' real foundation of support was coming from South Australia, wasn't it?
It was. And in addition to the National Service Group and the referendum, to illustrate that point, and his special friends, these key people, the message that Menzies gave, not least on radio, to all Australians, and everything they read about Menzies resonated with the people of South Australia. They wanted Menzies. They wanted Menzies' message. For example, he gave the radio broadcast in May 1942 when he was outside of being leader of the opposition. He was a backbencher, but he spent his time well and gave a series of radio broadcasts. One was called The Forgotten People, which, as we all know, is about middle Australia. It's about the middle man, the middle woman, the middle family, the ordinary Aussie who wants a good outcome, who's aspirational and who work hard and he wants Australia to win. This vision of the forgotten people, hey, the South Australian people, they loved it. And they were with him on philosophy and policy as well.
I think it's fascinating to have that perspective, Baden, about how on board South Australia was with the Menzies agenda, the Menzies philosophy, and of course through their political representatives, the formation of this new political party. Before we get on to the actual founding of the Liberal Party in 1944, I wondered if you could talk to me about that 1943 election, the federal election, when obviously the Curtin Labor government is seeking re-election and the UAP is the opposition. I mean, it was a terrible result, of course, for the UAP more broadly across the country, and out of it they really just pulled up stumps and away Menzies went with the new project. But how did things go for the LCL in South Australia at that 43 election?
Well, state-wise, Playford was king. He was premier. He was triumphant. He was doing very, very well. He was achieving the best outcomes that South Australia had ever seen for industrial growth, for jobs, for huge population growth. Okay. But the people of South Australia then, and often always since, differentiate between state and federal politics. And the smell of the UAP decay was just as ripe in South Australia as it was everywhere else. So Hughes and the UAP suffered the same kind of defeat in South Australia as they did everywhere else in Australia. In fact, we lost our entire Senate team. It was led by McBride in 43. Menzies was inconsolable about his friend losing, even in number one spot.
That is a pretty catastrophic defeat, isn't it? I have here a quote from a letter Menzies wrote Philip McBride after this election loss, and he said, "The greatest loss that our side of politics has suffered in this election arises from your defeat in South Australia." So, yes, as you say, Menzies was devastated.
He was devastated, and of course, McBride used his time out of Parliament very, very well to form the Liberal Party of Australia. He had plenty of resources. He was a rich pastoralist. He could travel anywhere. He could do anything together with Menzies. So from the Unity Conference onwards, especially late 44 and all through 45, he's free. And he became a foundation member of the Federal Executive. He's a representative of South Australia on the Federal Conference of the LPA. And he is a beaver. He works hard to get the LPA up. The next election was 46, and he by then was successful in the seat of Wakefield. So he became the member of Wakefield until he retired in 58. So, he was a direct ally. He was in and out of Menzies' office all the time. Menzies' staff knew McBride. They wept when he was defeated as number one in the Senate, and so it goes on. He was a friend of Menzies. So 43, South Australia had only one success, and that was Archie Cameron in Barker. The numbers were just overwhelming in Barker for him, but Every other seat was lost to Labor.
Amazing. So the Liberal Country League had, across the two Houses of Parliament, one representative, Archie Cameron, who, as you said, was a bit of a firebrand himself, bit of a loose cannon.
And also, he was by then totally converted to the future LPA and to work with Menzies.
So tell me about this South Australian contingent who goes to the Unity Conference. Obviously, McBride is playing a pivotal role now out of politics, well, at least out of the Parliament, very much involved in politics. But South Australia is unified in its attendance at this Unity Conference, unlike the situation of delegates from other states, which presents in itself a bit of a model for the other states in how to progress your political ambitions without dissent, because in politics, disunity is death, isn't it?
Well, exactly. So South Australia was united and was, in fact, the exemplar model to get the LPA achieved. Now, there were 7 delegates from South Australia. All of them were LCL. They were the president, the former president, the premier, the president of the Women's Council, the general secretary of the party, and Phil McBride, the lead Senate candidate who was so active in the process. These delegates, they'd been united for a decade. They knew each other. They all supported Menzies. They all welcomed the message of the forgotten people. They all unanimously endorsed Menzies' draft constitution for the LP, for the Liberal Party of Australia, and for the objectives that he set forth for the Liberal Party of Australia. So they were just absolutely united. And beyond all other states, there was no country party. They embraced the country as well. And Menzies, of course, said early in August 44 that he would love the country party to come to the Unity Conference, but they decided not to come. They wanted to be themselves, and so that was a bridge too far. But Menzies at the conference and at all times emphasised how important it was for the Liberal Party of Australia to be in coalition with the country party nationally. South Australia already had that coalition. So the group that went to the October Unity Conference were totally united. And moreover, in the first months of the Liberal Party of Australia, the largest number of branches and the largest number of members of the LPA as of August 45, when the first federal conference was held, at least per capita, was from South Australia. And the LCL branch structure was exactly becoming the Liberal Party of Australia branch structure.
Yeah, so actually the LCL was an incredibly dominant influence on the formation of the Liberal Party of Australia. And that membership, the massive membership from South Australia that formed the membership of the Liberal Party of Australia, that must have had a very influential role in those early policy debates and development of the political party.
I think that's correct. And Menzies, for example, was still remembering that when he invited Phil McBride, by then the Honourable Sir Philip McBride, to become the Liberal Party of Australia federal president. And he said to him in the 50s, we need to get the New South Wales group and the Victorian group to work together, and you as a South Australian are the perfect person to get that reconciliation and to inspire the unity we need.
I think it was Phil McBride as well, Baden, who drafted the We Believe statement in 1954 on the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Liberal Party, which of course lasts to this day. It's a set of statements that encapsulate the political philosophy of Liberal Party members and of course Liberal Party politicians and the policy and influences the policy agenda if and when they're in government.
You're right, Georgina, and this is the kind of background work, homework, preparation that Phil McBride had every opportunity to do because he was totally committed to do anything. And moreover, he was a leading politician. He was close, a very close friend of Menzies. So therefore, he could put all of his skills together. And we believe he put the right words together. He made it consistent with the objectives that Menzies had drafted. His heart was in it. He was superb, man. I really regard him as a great Liberal South Australian.
So it was called the Liberal Country League despite the formation of the Liberal Party of Australia, in South Australia this is. So that's obviously different today. In 2024, you have the Liberal Party of Australia and the Liberal Party of South Australia. They're the same name, and for the public's purposes, they pretty much are the same thing. When did the name change from Liberal Country League to Liberal Party?
It was 1974. I was present and was part of that decision.
So that's a 50-year anniversary this year.
Exactly. And I was on the state executive at the time, the State Council. The point is that the name LCL was kept on from 44 until 74. That's another 30 years, primarily because of Playford. That is the momentum and all the association that the name LCL conjured for South Australian voters and focused in Playford's success was the right name. But the changes in Australia socially, economically, demographically, in every kind of way, were enormous during the 50s and 60s, and Playford never appreciated those changes. And, of course, after 30 years, his time had come. So he was defeated in 65. As late as 65, he was Premier right through to 65.
Yeah, it's quite amazing.
Now, this then led to Hall becoming leader, and Hall very quickly understood the importance of electoral fairness, and he led the reform of the House. There was therefore a period of dramatic change. In my book, I call it civil war, between the old LCL, change-less people, and the new, let's make a modern Liberal Party members of the LCL. And the best way to symbolise the new constitution that we established in 1974, the new policy platform, first time it had ever been published. I was policy coordinator, I drafted it. The best way to demonstrate the new modern Liberal Party was to actually get our already 30-year name, Liberal Party of Australia, and to make that our one name. And so we've been Liberal Party of Australia for 50 years now, ever since.
Was it controversial, Baden, to change
No,
the name?
it wasn't at all. No, it was not controversial.
The time had come.
Yep, the time had come, and David Tonkin was on the make. He became leader of the opposition in 75, and he became Premier in 79. He was very much a part of that whole process, as was Jennifer Cashmore, as was so on, many of us. And that whole push, Dean Brown, even conservative good leaders like Trevor Griffin, understood that there had to be a new constitution, a new policy platform, and a new name.
What did that mean, though, for country interests in the Liberal Party? I mean, it had been one and the same party for so long that, of course, there was a tradition of acting as one party, but losing the country part of the name, did that have an impact, do you think, on the regions, on rural seats?
I don't think it has an impact. We've got a council in the Liberal Party called the Rural and Regional Council, very active, very alive, has quite a deal of influence in the State Council and the Parliamentary Party. That's one way. We have probably a majority of country members of Parliament still. We tend to win the country, and winning government is all about winning a majority of city seats to add to, if you like, country base. So I used to represent the whole state as a senator, and as I went to all branches and everywhere, there was no controversy about the missing name, a country. We were the Liberal Party of Australia, and we're all united about that.
Baden, it's a fascinating story, and I do thank you for bringing it to our listeners of Afternoon Light. And, of course, you've got a chapter in our upcoming book, Unity and Autonomy, on this very story, which we're very grateful for, and looking forward to sharing it with people in October for the commemoration of the founding of the Liberal Party at the Unity Conference, of course, in 1944. So thank you so much, Baden.
Well, thank you, Georgina, and it's been a pleasure to write that chapter. It's an exciting story, South Australia and Menzies, and it fits in nicely with my book, The Liberal Story, about the Liberal Party in South Australia. It's been a pleasure to talk about it all, and I look forward to the 50 years of the Liberal Party in South Australia being Liberal Party of Australia, but also 80 years since the Unity Conference. I hope I can be with you personally.
Yes, and 80 years of Baden Teague too.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.